Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic hypersonic.
Positronic hypersonic.
Positronic hypersonic.
I'm Barry P. Cook, and I'm here to talk to you about the penultimate episode of Season 3 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It was called Terrarium. And as the episode starts, Erica Ortegas, the ship's pilot, takes a specially modified shuttle into an area of space with volatile gravity fluxes that she says in her log would normally be investigated by something called Division 12, which would seem to be a reference to the Starfleet 12th Strategic Force, a military unit and strategic force, in a Star Trek RPG as part of the Orion's module, in order to deploy a buoy to enable Starfleet to research the area, but ends up crashing on an inhospitable planet or planetoid when the shuttle falls into a wormhole. 2 days later, the crew of the Enterprise is trying to determine if Ortegas can be retrieved, but they're struggling to find any trace of her from their side of the wormhole. Back on the other side of the wormhole, while looking for a food source, Ortegas determines that the planet's moon will pass right through the planet's thermosphere, and that she needs to get back to the shuttle soon before she sees a flickering light in the distance. Meanwhile, Enterprise discovers her emergency broadcast on their side of the wormhole. Upon investigating the light, Ortegas discovers a cave where a stranded Gorn has been living, and is confronted by it, but to her surprise, it spares her to grab a nearby creature for food, and then shares some of the food with Ortegas. Later, when the Gorn is asleep, Ortegas steals its comms array, and on her way back to her shuttle, she sees a light which stops her in her tracks, but before she can get back to the shuttle, it's destroyed by what seemed to be an incoming storm. So she heads back to the only other shelter she knows of and is approached by the Gorn, who then saves itself and Ortegas from attack by other creatures, before shielding its shelter with Ortegas inside, after which Ortegas helps it repair damage to its leg, and it again shares food with her. On Enterprise, the captain decides to enact a plan derived by Uhura with Spock's help to send the Enterprise into the wormhole to keep it from closing and to try to find and rescue Ortegas, but he doesn't know that Uhura juiced the figures to make it seem a little more viable as a mission than it actually would have been, according to the simulations and projections. Down on the planet, Ortegas and her new friend work together to try to get the Gorn's communication equipment working well enough to contact the ship, after Ortegas develops a rudimentary translator that allows her to understand when her new friend is saying yes or no, though somehow the Gorn has figured out how to understand Ortegas when she speaks. She and the Gorn play a couple of rudimentary board games together before getting the communications equipment ready, and when her new friend's infection seems to be getting worse, she resists Ortegas' efforts to try and help her deal with it, and seems to suggest that Ortegas should kill her because she fears her people will kill her if she's seen as weak upon rescue, but Ortegas says that she's not going to let that happen. Enterprise slowly makes its way into the wormhole at impulse power and wedges it open with a warp field surrounding itself and starts searching for Ortegas, who is seemingly determined that something is watching her and her new friend, just before a bunch of scaly crawly things attack. And in the attack, the shield over the shelter and the communications array both get damaged. So Ortegas comes up with a plan to try to light the atmosphere of a nearby gas giant on fire so that Enterprise will see where she is. But of course, it's dangerous because they'll then be at the center of a burning atmospheric event, which causes the Gorn to disagree initially with her idea, but later she decides to help Erica enact it. Just as Enterprise is determining that it needs to pull out of the wormhole because it's on a deadline to get some vaccine to another planet, Mr. Spock picks up the atmospheric burning, and Pike sends a landing party to rescue Ortegas, and mistaking her for a threat, La'an kills the Gorn, upsetting Ortegas, before a Metron reveals itself and explains that it was observing she and the Gorn as an experiment, but then erases Ortegas' memory of him revealing himself to her before she's beamed up and has a reunion with Uhura. And that's where the episode ended. So I actually liked this episode quite a bit. It was refreshing to see them actually do an episode of Star Trek, rather than these pseudo Star Trek episodes they've been doing where they just pervert everything that Star Trek is, or a lot of it anyway. It was just a really solid episode of sci-fi television. Everybody acted normally on the ship. Everybody acted like an officer in, a hierarchical organization, a military organization. They acted like professionals. They didn't do anything dumb. They didn't do anything that was like, there's no way they would have done that kind of thing. Spock acted like Spock. And now, of course, it was also derivative of the Louis Gossett Jr. movie Enemy Mine and the TNG episode The Enemy, which, of course, is also a derivative of that film, and the Enterprise episode Dawn, which is also a derivative of that film, as well as, in my opinion, the DS9 episode Duet, which, though it didn't take place on a planet, explores a lot of the same themes and sort of puts the characters through similar paces. It was also, of course, a derivative of the original series episode Arena, where Kirk fights with a Gorn captain. But that episode was different in tone from this one because it never really got past the whole I'm going to kill you part, whereas this one, very quickly did. Anyway, despite all that, I liked it. I do want to point out there was a quick mention in the episode of Captain Decker, who of course later becomes Commodore Decker, and his ship, the Constellation, which shows up on the original series. But despite liking it, I have to say it wasn't a perfect episode. Like, if the Gorn had this shield for its cave, why wasn't it shields up when Ortegas first approached? Like, how was she able to just get in there? Why wasn't the shield up? That's kind of silly, right? Also, I wasn't buying that the Gorn figured out how to understand everything Ortegas was saying just by observing humans in the past or by observing her, but not able to say words in a human language or the same language. Other than that, the only thing I didn't like about the episode was the appearance of the Metron at the end because it was unnecessary. Like, the episode stands perfectly on its own as a story very similar to, like I said, Enemy Mine and so forth. So why the Metron? Maybe the reason they included the Metron was at least in part because they wanted to try to explain why nobody knows who the Gorn are in the future. And of course, I say that because one of the things the Metron says that at some point in the future, we may need to reset your perception of the Gorn.
You won't remember me. And perhaps someday, we may need to reset your perception of the Gorn as well.
Which is a little vague. Not only that, the question I have is how? How are they going to reset the perception of the entirety of the Federation or even just the entirety of Starfleet from a distance? Or can they just be anywhere at any time? I mean, the Q can, so maybe the Metrons can. And I think they would have to be able to. And I say that because I went back and watched Arena because I wanted to make sure I knew what I was talking about when I addressed this question of the Gorn. And so in that episode, what happens is the Enterprise is visiting a colony and they find it destroyed. And then shortly after finding it destroyed, they're attacked by the Gorn, although they don't know it's the Gorn. And they pursue the Gorn ship. And that's when they end up crossing into Metron space. And the rest of the episode unfolds where Kirk has to fight the Gorn captain. And in talking with the one survivor they find of the colony, it turns out that the colony people didn't recognize the attack as having been made by the Gorn, so they don't seem to be familiar with the Gorn. And when Sulu's talking with the captain before they chase the Gorn ship, he says that he doesn't recognize the ship, that the ship doesn't match any other ship that Starfleet knows of. So clearly, the whole of Starfleet doesn't know about the Gorn, or at least the records on Enterprise reflect a Starfleet that doesn't know about the Gorn. And Sulu himself doesn't recognize the ship. And then, of course, Kirk makes it very clear that he's never heard of the Gorn either. And then later, when the crew is shown the Gorn on the viewer, Uhura, at the very least, is aghast at the Gorn's appearance, that it's a reptile creature. And then at the end, Kirk says something to the Metron about, well, maybe we can talk with the Gorn and reach an agreement. Again, indicating that as far as he knows, the Federation has never heard of the Gorn because otherwise he'd know that what's already transpired between them and the Gorn would seem to have long ago passed the point of diplomacy. It's also revealed that the messages that the Enterprise got asking it to come to the colony were faked. They weren't actually from the colony. So it would have to be the case that the Metrons, for some unknown reason, tricked the Enterprise into an encounter with the Gorn, after which the Gorn coincidentally fled into Metron space, into which the Enterprise chased it. But that doesn't make sense because the Metron in the beginning says that it only made Kirk fight the Gorn captain after it observed the Enterprise chasing the Gorn and decided that they were both violent and needed to settle their differences one-on-one. So I don't know, maybe we're supposed to believe that the Gorn tricked the Enterprise into going there, and then the encounter with the Metrons was not related to them having gone to the colony earlier. It would literally have to mean that the Metrons, by the time of Kirk's command of the Enterprise, went out of their way to reset the perception of the entirety of the Federation or even just the entirety of Starfleet from a distance. I don't know. The line about we might have to alter your perception of the Gorn really just creates more questions. It doesn't solve anything. It doesn't explain, at least not well, why nobody seems to know who the Gorn are in the future. It just kind of dangles an idea where the audience can go, oh, well, maybe that's it. And I think that's kind of lazy and flimsy and crappy, and I don't care for it. I wish they had just left the Metrons out of it because it just just makes the issue even less clear, or it asks you to take leaps at the very least. And, we can already take leaps. We don't need you dangling the Metrons in front of us to take a leap and say, well, maybe something happened that made them forget. I mean, we were already there. We didn't need you to dangle the Metrons in our face unless you were going to explicitly state something that directly explains why they don't remember them in the future. But anyway, regardless of the continuity issue, I thought that dropping the Metron in at the end was unnecessary. I mean, they did it in Arena, but there it was necessary because the Metrons had started the whole thing. You have to end the thing with them. But here it just was tacked on, and it seemed tacked on only for the purpose of being a callback and trying to explain why they don't remember the Gorn in the future, why the crew doesn't seem to know about the Gorn in the future, and it doesn't do that very well. So I thought it should have been left out. But other than that, this was a really good episode of Star Trek. Now, like I said, it was derivative and they didn't reinvent the wheel, and it wasn't a landmark episode like, The Inner Light or Measure of a Man or some of the great hallmark episodes of the original series in Deep Space Nine, but it was a really good episode. I thought it had heart. At a couple of moments, it had me a little choked up. I thought it was a great vehicle for the actress that plays Ortegas. I thought she did a really great job. I was happy to see an Ortegas-focused episode because I like that character. It was just really well done, and I don't know why they can't do episodes like this, 9 out of 10 times, 90% of every season. Why do they only seem to do these episodes 4% of the time, 5% of the time? It's really unfortunate. They clearly know how to make really good Star Trek because this episode proves it, as have a few others in the past, but they just opt not to most of the time, and it's infuriating. But that's really all there is to say. There's one more episode of the season. I, of course, will be back to do a breakdown and review of that, and I think I'm also going to do a short video reviewing the whole season, which I haven't done before, but I'm going to do that. For now, though, I'm going to get out of here. Until I return, I wish you peace and long life.